Welcome to our webinar. My name is Rene Michele. I'm a proud ambassador for Stepping Out program, and I will be your moderator today. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which we meet today and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to any First Nations people who are present today. It is a pleasure to welcome our three special guest speakers. Georgia Zentrich, member of the Stepping Out Board, who will present from the perspective of lived experience. Andrea Simcox, trauma clinician, senior psychologist for the Adult Survivors of Child Sexual Abuse Project. And Jackie Maxton, solicitor, senior associate at the Shopfront Youth Legal Centre. You can submit questions via the Q&A icon, and we will try and answer as many as possible after the presentations. If anything discussed today raises issues for you, please contact Lifeline on 13 11 14 for immediate support, or you can contact Stepping Out during business hours. Please welcome our first speaker, Georgia.
Hello, everyone. So today I'm going to be reading a short story that I wrote a few years ago about my experience of processing CSA. So I was a young child. I didn't speak out. I didn't understand it was wrong. I was too young. I was told not to speak out. I was only a child. I didn't know any better. I can never blame myself. It was never my fault. This was the worst thing that ever happened to me, and I wish I could have changed it. I was about 16 years old when my parents divorced. I had a relationship breakdown with my boyfriend at the time. I attempted to take my own life. I thought it was the only way. It wasn't. I ended up in hospital, and guilt overwhelmed me as my family struggled to comprehend what I had tried to do. I was then referred on to a clinical psychologist. I thought it was the worst thing that happened to me. When I was 19 years old and in my second year of university, I was hospitalized for severe eczema. My face was covered in blisters and half swollen. I was hospitalized because my mum didn't know how to help me anymore. The doctors didn't know how to help either. They didn't know what it was. The old ladies who roamed the halls of the ward assumed that I was a burns victim. I looked like Frankenstein, and I truly felt like a monster. My mental health really suffered. I struggled with my university studies to the point where I thought that the only option I would have was to drop out. I thought it was the worst thing that happened to me. I was 20 years old. As a third-year psychology student, I was watching some lectures on psychological trauma. I also watched the movie The Butterfly Effect. Something about this movie triggered memories of abuse for me, ones that I had suppressed, ones that I had tried to forget. My memories were so fragmented, yet they kept on playing over and over on repeat. I wanted them to stop, but I couldn't make them disappear. It was in this moment that I knew I needed to see my psychologist. What if she thinks I'm crazy? What if she thinks I'm making this up? At this stage, I had been seeing her for about 4 years and I'd never spoken about any of this. I was struggling to speak out. I was starting to understand what had happened, how wrong it was, how innocent I was. I was just doing what I was told to do. I didn't speak out at the time. I tried to blame myself. I wanted to, but this was not my fault. This was the worst thing that ever happened to me, and I wish I could have changed it. This was the worst thing that ever happened to me. The initial processing of these memories was the hardest. I was seeing my psychologist almost weekly to receive ongoing support. My mental health had never been as low as it was in this time of my life. I was extremely depressed. Most days I thought about taking my own life. I was so sensitive, and the little things that people would do irritated me, even if they did these things unintentionally. everything just seemed too much. I had never gone through anything like this before, and I didn't think that things were ever going to get better. When I was about 20 years old, I was hanging out with some of my old friends from high school. One of them just happened to ask, "What's the worst thing that you've ever been through?" Everyone mentioned the death of one of our close high school friends who passed away a few years ago. And I mean, we all agreed that was hard. I experienced that, but no one yet knew about what I had been through. And it was then that I opened up and told them about my experiences of being abused as a child. All of the blame, it was still there. I was struggling to speak out, but starting to try. It was even harder than I thought it would be, opening up to people, after shutting my emotions off and suppressing everything for so many years. People were telling me how young I was and that I didn't know what I was doing. They told me it wasn't my fault and that they wished they would have known earlier. I tried my hardest not to blame myself. I didn't want to anymore, but what happened to me was in no way my fault. It was the worst thing that happened to me, and I wish I could have changed it. At the time of writing this story, I had recently graduated from an honours degree in psychology with the career goal of becoming a clinical child psychologist. I'm driven to help others through what I have been through, to help them understand that their trauma may be a part of their identity and it may impact them in ways that are often inexplicable at the time, but it does not need to define them. It's not an easy goal, but I believe in myself wholeheartedly, and I know that I can achieve this. What I'm most proud of is the fact that I'm still here. My experiences have allowed me to become a more empathetic and understanding person, and they have driven me towards where I aim to be in life, helping other people. I'm proud that I've made it through the darker times, and not without struggles, but without those struggles, I don't believe that I would be the person that I am today. Over time, I've become more comfortable speaking to my close friends and family about my experiences, and now having the opportunity to share it in this space is really incredible. I know that there are people I can really trust who can offer the support that I need. I was so young and naive, but it wasn't my fault. We all wished something had happened earlier, but it didn't. I can't blame myself. I don't need to anymore. This was not my fault. And even though it is hard, I don't need to feel personally responsible. It was the worst thing that ever happened to me in my life so far, but I am who I am because of what happened to me. My experiences have not broken me, they have built me, and I do not wish I could have changed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgia. I would like to welcome our next speaker, Andrea.
Thank you. And hi, everyone. I'm really honoured to be here today. Thanks to Pam and Melissa from Stepping Out for inviting me. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the First Nations people of Australia, the traditional custodians of the land upon which I live and upon which I'm speaking to you all today, the lands of the Wallumattagal clan of the Darug Nation. I pay my respects to all Aboriginal elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the lived experience of all victims and survivors of colonisation, of adverse childhood events, and to all people with a lived experience of child sexual abuse and mental distress. 3 years ago, we heard the Australian Prime Minister apologise nationally to all victims and survivors for the sexual abuse they had suffered as children. the courage and generosity of survivors who had shared their stories, often painful and traumatic aspects of their lives, with the Royal Commission from 2012 to 2017, so over 8,000 people, is evidence of that extraordinary capacity, the courage and resilience of survivors in reclaiming strength and agency in their lives. As service providers and supporters, we're indebted to everyone who participated, and we're here today to remember and honour all victims and survivors, including those of you who have been able to talk and those of you who haven't, for all that you've done and for all that you continue to do to survive what happened to you. I'd also like to thank Stepping Out for creating this space, CSA Awareness Week, for us to recognise and mark the 3rd anniversary of the National Apology. Thank you also for all of the incredible work that your team does for and with survivors as their supporters and advocates and their champions for change and as their partners in healing. So a little bit about me. My name's Andrea and I'm a psychologist and a trauma clinician with the Adult Survivor Project. The Royal Commission heard from thousands of survivors that they live with profound and wide-ranging impacts of child sexual abuse, affecting all aspects of their lives. It was found that our current service systems are inadequate in regards to their capability and their capacity to respond to the needs of adult survivors, who are often involved with multiple disconnected services such as mental health, drug and alcohol, and sexual assault. And Bev, if we could just go back one slide, I think, please. The resulting merry-go-round of service presentations and representations, the telling and retelling of painful trauma histories, long referral processes, strict criteria for services, it all contributes to negative and traumatising experience. So in 2019, New South Wales Health funded a 2-year pilot project to explore innovative practice that integrates all of those siloed systems to improve our outcomes for adult survivors. At the centre of the work that we're doing on the project are the voices of adult survivors with whom we're collaborating to hear about what they need from services. Together, we're working to develop a new model of care, which will soon inform a statewide rollout of a new adult survivor of child sexual assault service from mid next year. So I started working with the adult survivor team earlier this year, and I feel really privileged to be part of this important and innovative work. Prior to that, to this role, I spent about 15 years working as a mental health clinician in a public community mental health service here in Sydney. Clients of that service I worked at were being treated for a range of diagnoses, usually at the more severe end of the spectrum, including schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, OCD, depression, PTSD, borderline personality disorder, and others. I worked as part of a multidisciplinary team with doctors and nurses and allied health clinicians. And as mental health clinicians, we would assess what was going on for clients. We'd look at what the problem was. We'd talk about symptoms and how we were going to manage them. We'd suggest a diagnosis, recommend a treatment plan, including medication, and we'd provide them with some support to help with their goals, things like returning to work or study or to live independently. Notes would sometimes make a reference to trauma. Sometimes things in assessments would be written like history of childhood abuse or background of CSA, but the dots didn't always necessarily connect in the mental health formulations or in our mental health treatment plans. The focus was on treating and managing symptoms of illness, so things like anxiety, thoughts of self-harm, worthlessness, suspiciousness, compulsive checking behaviours, or paranoia, or auditory hallucinations or visual hallucinations. I don't think that it was considered often enough that what we were viewing as symptoms of an illness was actually probably an effect of childhood trauma rather than just a cluster of biological symptoms, that these were normal survival responses to abnormal experiences of trauma. It's well documented that distress is often a result of experiences of adversity, and that these adversities can lead to shame and powerlessness and hopelessness. By over-medicalising that distress, the blame is inadvertently placed on the lap of survivors. So on their personal characteristics or their negative thinking patterns or their avoidant traits. So rather than seeing things as understandable and functional reactions to overwhelming events. I look back at my time working in mental health fondly, but I think that the emphasis on this medicalised model, which is still alive and well, is missing the point. As talk show host Oprah Winfrey recently said, and I've got a joke in here about the whole, you get a car, but I don't think I'm going to do that because I can't see your faces and it's just going to be awkward if nobody laughs. So I'll just talk about it being awkward instead. I'll just move on. Oprah said in her latest book title, What Happened to You?, that by shifting our response to trauma, by looking through a trauma lens, we can build a renewed sense of personal self-worth and ultimately recalibrate our responses. She's nailed it. Now, of course, this isn't a new concept in the trauma space, but she's right. We shouldn't be looking at people's distress from the perspective of what's wrong with them, but as what's happened to them. These diagnostic labels that are applied with the intention of trying to help us to understand can actually just lead to more harm and stigmatization and disempowerment and distress. So clinicians, and for some survivors themselves, they miss seeing that link. They miss seeing the way that trauma is still playing out in survivors' lives. If the impact of trauma isn't acknowledged and instead just seen as symptoms of a, maybe biological illness, then the questions that need to be asked, what has happened to you? How did this affect you? And what did you have to do to survive? They simply won't be asked. So that brings me to the theme for today, for this year's webinar, It's Time to Talk. I hope you don't mind too much, Pam, but I'd like to suggest a little change to the title, which is that it's time to talk and it's time to ask. A few years into my career in mental health, I started working with the DBT team, providing therapy mostly for women who met criteria for the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. Here, the focus was much more on what had happened rather than just what was wrong. We would ask, and then we would draw together the links between the experience of neglect or abuse in these women's earlier lives and the difficulties they were having today with managing distress or regulating emotions or struggles with their self-identity or their patterns of relationship problems. And we'd spend more time understanding the functions of those behaviours, which they'd relied on for survival, dissociation or self-harm or recurring thoughts of suicide. And then we could reframe those behaviours as effects, not as symptoms of trauma and abuse. And that made a lot of sense to us as clinicians, and it made a lot of difference for these women to be able to understand themselves in that way and to make sense of those responses. Skip ahead a bit more, just before I came to my job today with the adult survivor team, I was working as a perinatal and infant mental health clinician with women who developed severe mental distress and illness in the perinatal period, often just sort of seemingly out of the blue. And the dots were really joining up for me now, because these women were 3 to 4 times more likely to develop depression or anxiety in pregnancy if they'd experienced childhood sexual abuse. Of course, not everyone who's been abused in childhood will develop mental health issues, and we can't say that there's one experience or one factor alone that causes an outcome. Humans are a lot more complicated than that, but and while some people don't develop illness or injury as a result of CSA, many do. And so whether it's causal or associated, if it's biochemical or neurobiological or epigenetic, what we do know is that child sexual abuse significantly increases the risk of mental ill health outcomes in adult survivors. An overwhelming majority, up to around 90% of public mental health clients have experiences of early trauma. So the research is vast and it's compelling. And it's not just my experience as a naive young grad all those years ago that was, hugging a copy of the DSM close to my chest and quickly doing a check of all the diagnostic criteria to find out what was wrong with people. It wasn't just me who didn't always ask. There was a study looking at how often mental health staff inquire about childhood trauma, and only about 28% of abuse cases were found in clients' notes. Less than 22% of clients in that study reported even being asked. Another survey of New Zealand women who'd been sexually abused in childhood and then later treated by mental health services found that 63% had never been asked about childhood sexual abuse by mental health staff. Those who present with psychotic disorders are even less likely to be asked, even though the odds of developing psychosis double in clients who have been abused. Whilst I've worked with some brilliant trauma-informed psychiatrists and nurses and allied health staff who do ask and do respond well to disclosures, screening for child sexual abuse in mental health services is still not happening routinely and not consistently enough. And we know about the prevalence. 1 in 6 women, that's 16% of all women who have experienced CSA. So that's a lot of people who are walking through the doors of mental health services asking for help. By not asking and by not acknowledging and by not bringing trauma to the front of a client's story, instead leaving it somewhere in the dark corners of their history, it's not being brought into psychiatric formulations, it's not being brought into client support plans. And without the trauma lens, mental health services can't adequately see the burden of this complex trauma, which is at the core of complex needs of adult survivors. So the research shows it. Survivors at the Royal Commission shared it, and now in my role with the adult survivor team, clients are telling us that the abuse they experienced has deeply affected their mental well-being, and they want mental health services to know about it and to understand the impacts better, and so that they can be supported better. So it's not enough just that research is paying more attention to this. Services need to reflect this in their practice and procedures too. Clinicians can begin to do this by asking patients or clients about childhood abuse routinely and responding well when the answer is yes. A large part of our work at the Adult Survivor Project has involved meeting with and hearing from various services and clinicians across the district about their ways of working with survivors. And consistent themes have come up relating to the uncertainty when it comes to knowing what to say, or what are the best ways of responding and following up when an adult discloses childhood sexual abuse and trauma. There's many staff, many clinicians who are concerned that by asking or by saying the wrong thing, that they would further traumatise a person and make matters worse. So building capacity and confidence of staff is a priority of our work on the project. And the project has created a number of short training modules, as well as partnering with training agencies to deliver trauma-specific adult survivor training. And I recently heard a beautiful example from Melissa here at Stepping Out, who shared her way of asking, which I thought is so simple and so effective, and it's now informed the way that I ask clients, which is, we know that many people who we talk to have been sexually abused as children. Is this something that you identify with? So mental health services should be asking all service users, and they need to ask early, otherwise it can slip through the cracks, and sometimes that's for years and decades. And we must, however, in asking, also ensure that we let clients know that they have control over whether or when they disclose. So ask every client, but let every client know that she has control over what she says and when she says it and to whom she says it. By not asking about sexual abuse, because not asking about sexual abuse can give that tacit support to the survivor's belief that their abuse doesn't matter or that it doesn't have any relevance in their struggles, and it can mean that good support gets missed out on. These dots need to be connected, because the impacts of even severe early trauma can be resolved and the negative intergenerational effects can be intercepted. People can and do recover if the right support is provided at the right time in the right way. So it's time to ask, and it's time to listen, it's time to believe, and it's time to talk. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Andrea. welcome our final speaker, Jackie.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jackie Maxton and I'm a solicitor at the Shopfront Youth Legal Centre. Many of you perhaps don't know who we are, so I'm just going to explain a little bit about who we are and who we assist. In 1989, the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission released a report, and it was on our homeless children. It's known as the Burdekin Report. And one of the main findings was that homeless young people are basically not being accorded their basic human rights and are missing out on access to justice at every level of the proceedings. So a joint venture was formed between Herbert Smith Freehills, which is an international law firm, Mission Australia and the Salvation Army. And our brief is to provide free legal services to homeless and disadvantaged young people up to 25 years of age. Now, there of course are a number of legal services such as legal aid and the Aboriginal Legal Service who provide excellent legal services, but our brief is to assist those young people who are just not coping with the justice system because of a background of homelessness, trauma, including CSA and physical abuse, and mental health, substance abuse issues, cognitive impairments, which means that they enter, particularly in the adult criminal justice system, at a significant disadvantage. If you think about it, if you're a homeless young person who, upon turning 18, is magically supposed to be able to manage the adult criminal justice system, attend appointments, to validate their earnings, to get access to legal aid, to tell your story in a clear way, you are going to be at a significant disadvantage. The other thing that we provide at Shopfront, which I think is extremely important, is we provide consistency of representation. If we take on a client, there are only 3 permanent solicitors, and every 6 months we get a secondee from our parent company. And we provide consistency of advocacy and representation. This means that if a client comes to us, they don't have to keep retelling their story. They are treated in a respectful way. And we also have a vast network of referrals in the mental health, public health, and casework and social work support services. And we have a caseworker who works with us to support these clients. So they get a holistic type of representation, and these are the most vulnerable young people in our community. Once they usually come to us in crisis, as in they've received court papers, they've been arrested, and what's very common, we call it the trifecta, being homeless brings them into contact with police constantly. And if you're homeless, traumatized and self-medicating with substances, illegal substances, again, you're going to come into contact with police constantly. And the trouble is that if you react badly, so if you are stopped by police because you don't have a train ticket, a very common thing for homeless young people who've been told they have to go to appointments but not told how to get there. If they react badly, they struggle, suddenly they have a raft of charges. So their ticket becomes an assault police charge and a resist arrest charge. They may even have damaged some property because police are extremely sensitive. And if you scratch their belts or whatever, it's damage to property. And suddenly you have a raft of serious charges. So once their criminal matters are finalised and they've been given the support they need, they come to me. And the majority of my practice is assisting these clients to claim victims' compensation through the Victims' Rights and Support Scheme, to basically receive compensation or some sort of restitution and support as a result of their background of childhood abuse, CSA, and domestic violence. And although the Victim Services Scheme is not perfect, in fact, far from it, I believe that some of the reports that I've received from many of the clients who come to me and who get support are important in terms of the theme of this talk and in terms of the healing process. So the victims, and again, sorry, I do not mean any disrespect. I'm using the word victim because that is the word that is in all of the legislation. And sadly, legislation hasn't caught up with common usage. So I apologise in advance if anyone is offended by this, but I'm limited to the terms of the system. So the Victim Support Scheme, the good thing about it, particularly for my client group who basically and understandably mistrust authority because no one has ever believed them. Most people in authority are seen as instituting punishment rather than support or assistance. And certainly none of them want to get back in the witness box after their experiences in the criminal justice system. So the clients are glad to hear that the Victim Support Scheme is done on the papers. This means that there is no court case, no trial, and it's just pieces of paper and we put them together and we forward them to be assessed. The downside of this, particularly with CSA, is that there aren't neat pieces of paper written by offenders saying, I did this on this date. And the first thing most clients will say to me is, I never told anyone. And often sitting in an interview room with me, just slowly taking our time with an end goal in sight, as in we're going to make this application, I often am privileged to receive first disclosures. But then it's like a forensic exercise. And a lot of people have come into contact with these young people over the years. And as Andrea has pointed out, a lot of them been to a lot of different counsellors, hospital admissions, the FACS or whatever they're called at the moment, Department of Communities and Justice have been involved. And although these young people are saying, I never told anyone, sometimes, luckily, people are noticing and writing things down. So for example, I had a client and she disclosed to me that she had been a victim of CSA by an uncle. And she said, I didn't tell anyone, I think my mother might have known. Anyway, we got a Department of Education records, and lo and behold, a police officer had come to the school to give a talk, the usual traffic stranger danger talk, when my client was 8 years old. There was a note in her file that she had gone up to the police officer and pulled on his coat, and she had disclosed to him about the abuse. And this formed the basis for a successful claim, because we then trawled through the facts documents and saw there were references there. Sadly, nothing was ever done about it. But when she received that decision from Victim Services, which effectively said, we believe you, this shouldn't have happened to you, and here is really a pathetic amount, but an amount of money as restitution. And this was huge for this client in terms of her healing, because she believed that she couldn't remember, because she was too little. She couldn't remember that she made that disclosure, but that it had been written down and that she had been believed by a government service was a big moment for her. Also, what I guess, in line with what Andrea was saying about how CSA impacts all different areas of life, I have another client who has sadly come into contact with the criminal justice system for possession of illegal substances and also for some offences of violence against family members. And to illustrate how all-pervading this trauma can be, she was an only child in a dysfunctional family. Father was also a drug user. Mother left him, started a new family. The only support she had was her nan. The thing is that nan got a boyfriend, and sadly the boyfriend sexually abused her. And when she disclosed it later, the response from the family was, shall I say, inappropriate. She was scheduled in a hospital. But what was worse, there was a notification to what was then fax. When she came out of hospital, they were trying to see where they could house her. Mother couldn't take her, father was inappropriate, and grandma refused to give up the boyfriend. Such a betrayal. From then on, my client was homeless, was self-medicating with illegal substances, and sadly a pattern of interaction with the criminal justice system. And as is actually confirmed in the statistics from the Royal Commission, that rage and that anger, which is sadly common in survivors of CSA, manifested in interactions with family members that were understandably, I would say, aggressive. And because we actually found out about all of this when I was interviewing her to talk about victims' compensation. And then we were able to find all the documents to back it all up. And we could explain to the court the background and the trauma that she had suffered. And it's because we had established that relationship. And I think that's what Andrea is saying. You need to ask and to talk and to listen so that clients their clients to me, but survivors feel safe and are able to disclose. And that I'm finding, and again, this is anecdotal, although supported by the findings of the Royal Commission, that a lot of young people, well, it's young people that I'm dealing with, have actually not thought about these things. I've actually gone through their fax or hospital records and seen references, as Andrea said, they just have a reference, CSA or, CSA and trauma, and no explanation of anything, and using that as a starting point to have that discussion, and then we can build a case to get them that vindication. And so I guess the main point, the main thrust, which again, as is supported by the statistics coming out of the Royal Commission, and also there was another study done by, sorry, I had this right in front of me. By the Australian Institute of Family Studies on the long-term effects of child sexual abuse. The sad thing is that most people who come to us as criminal defendants are also survivors of CSA. And the Royal Commission, when they did their interviews in custody, they found that most of the people there obviously were survivors of CSA, but there was a pattern. And I think this pattern that they described is very similar to almost every single one of my clients, that they said that their behaviour deteriorated in the years following the sexual abuse, most commonly in their teens and early 20s, which is our client group, years that are marked by increased substance abuse and antisocial and rebellious behaviour leading to criminal offending. So and that is exactly what we are seeing anecdotally in our practice, and addressing these factors, admitting and addressing these factors. And as I said, even though it's not a perfect system, I found that getting a determination from victim services saying, we believe you, seems to be a really good starting point for them to then address this trauma and therefore addressing the causes of their offending. And the idea is that once they reach 25, they're in a position to move on and to heal. So, and I guess another example of a client who was a client for violent offenders in relation to an ex-partner and in relation to her mother. And then she came to me and we were talking, and she disclosed physical and sexual abuse by her father. And once again, she said, no, you know, my mother knew, but I didn't tell anyone else. And her behavior deteriorated, this pattern that we see all the time. And she was kicked out of home as a teenager and was forced to rely upon, I suppose we'd say the kindness of strangers, but in fact it was violent partners to provide for her and support her. Anyway, we did do the forensic exercise, and we actually did find some evidence relating to disclosures of the abuse. And we got her the decision from the tribunal, from victim services, and it said exactly that. We believe you, this shouldn't have happened to you, and here's a recognition payment. And she disclosed to me that it was a huge moment to receive that. She got to a point where she'd been disbelieved so often that she was questioning whether it happened, like whether, and questioning herself. And of course that she was also getting angry and was at risk of more offending. And she said this was a big moment for her. So as I said, although it's not a perfect system, I found the process of being available to assist clients, believing them, fighting as hard as we can to get them recognition, has had a huge impact on their healing process. And look, I wish we could replicate our service. There are only 3 of us, and we can only help a very limited amount of people. But consistent with the theme of this seminar, from personal experience, I've found that for those young people who find themselves as criminal defendants and trying to deal with the justice system, who sadly are also survivors of CSA, that talking about it and hearing them, fighting to get them some sort of recognition, assists for them to take huge steps in terms of their healing. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our speakers for your interesting, very powerful and inspiring presentations. Now, we do have some questions that have come through, so thank you very much for that. Andrea, the first question is for you. We have one of our attendees that's interested in contributing to the Survivors Project. Could you provide some more details about the project and the involvement of consumers?
Thank you. Yes, Rene, absolutely. What I'll do is I'll put the contact details in the chat box so that if there is anyone that wants to know more about the project specifically or who would like to get involved in the project, we'd love to hear from you. So a big part of the work that is being done within the project is meeting with people with a lived experience. There are different a whole raft of different ways that people can participate. So the best way is to start with a phone call to either the project manager or to one of us on the team. I'll put the contact details in the box, and give us a call, and we can send you some information about the project or talk through with you what some of the options are in terms of whether you might like to meet with us and share your experience of using services, hopefully to contribute towards our new model of care. Or if you would like to seek information about accessing support yourself, that's also something that we can talk through. So I'll pop the details in the chat box.
Thanks so much for that, Andrea. The next question is for Jackie. Jackie, what supports are offered in the prison system for survivors? And is asking the question about abuse part of the actual intake process in the prison system?
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure that's something that corrective services do. And I do know from what clients have told us that different prisons have different systems. The only thing I can tell you is that victim services are offering approved counsellors, so you can apply for and get approved counselling in the prisons. But I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to exactly what kind of support. The only thing I can say is that it's my understanding that if a person is on remand, as in their bail refused, rather than serving a sentence, there are very, very few programs offered to them, which is extremely difficult, because if the idea is that you can show that you should get a better sentence or you can do all these good things, then sitting in custody on remand and not being offered any programs, especially substance abuse type programs, to me seems counterintuitive, but is, as I understand it, the current system.
Thanks so much for that, Jackie. Now, Georgia, I'd like to pass over to you right now. Firstly, because I was so impacted by your story from survivor to survivor, I just want to say thank you so much for having the courage to share with us your journey. I know how much that takes. And I just also want to reinforce the fact that, you know, we go through these experiences, but we can give back. And by being a part of these projects and sharing our stories and lending our support to organisations such as Stepping Out from a lived survivor experience, we can begin to knock down those walls that are stigmatised around the disbelief of, did this actually happen? The shame that we actually carry with us as survivors. And, you know, the years that we wander around in limbo, to now have specialist services such as Stepping Out, which I'm just so proud to be involved with. I just want to say every word of your story, Georgia, I just hung on to, because I could absolutely, you know, identify with everything that you're saying. So, you know, from my heart, and I know that everybody that's watching was really deeply impacted by your story. So thank you for that. So I just really wanted to ask you, as a board member for Stepping Out, could you share the support services and what is available through Stepping Out related to programs as such?
Yeah, definitely. So there are a variety of different services. So one of the ones is like a Living with CSA. It's like an 8-week workshop where when it was in person, the clients were coming in to do that in person. So that would cover things like, you know, self-care and triggers, and I guess just sort of helping them live with their, you know, their experiences of CSA. So the other one is there's like a weekly sort of inclusion group where, you know, it's just to help foster those social connections, get them, I guess, you know, improving their social well-being. So when we weren't in lockdown, they were running a yoga group, which is really great. There was a lot of positive feedback from the clients that they loved the yoga. So I don't know if that'll be starting again soon. And the other one is the sort of case management side of things. So, you know, the sort of staff members work with the clients to help them find a house, help refer them to other services, or just really provide that wraparound sort of support depending upon what their needs are. So, yeah.
Thanks so much, Georgia. That's amazing. And thank you so much for everything that you do for Stepping Out and for the survivors that come your way. Now, this question's actually for each panelist. If you could share from your own perspective. One of our attendees has asked, how can friends and family find support to help them navigate the trauma that survivors have experienced? So how can they learn to not victimize the survivor and therefore re-traumatize them further? What a great question.
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to jump in and say, as a lawyer for young people, I'm afraid I don't have much to add to that question. We specifically deal with the young people themselves, and so I'm afraid I don't have much to add to it.
Well, I think that there is some really good information available for people on the impacts of trauma. There are some excellent websites. There's Blue Knot that produces a lot of excellent material for survivors themselves, but also for supporters and families, friends. So starting by getting educated, what are the ways that trauma can impact on people, and by being supportive and listening. I think Jackie mentioned believing, giving people space, not having judgments, not asking too many questions, just being really guided by the person around what it is that they want you to know and what it is that they, want you to do with the information. Just to be there and to be safe and believing, I think, is a great start.
That's awesome, Andrea. Thank you so much. Georgia, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I guess just from the lived experience perspective is that I know that for me, that especially that initial time of processing everything, it was like a really tumultuous period for my mental health. It was just up and down and sort of everywhere. So I think most important is to, both try and be there for each other as much as you can, and understand that, sometimes it's not personal. It's just that there's a lot going on, underneath. So, and I think, like Andrea said, seeing any of those support resources, or even looking to get support as well, like for the friend or family member, because it can be a lot. It's sort of like they're trying to process it and you're trying to process it. So I think, both parties trying to, support each other and get the help. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Georgia. Now, that's all about time that we have time for today. Any questions that we haven't addressed while online, we will do so offline though. And again, if anything discussed today has raised issues for you, please contact Lifeline on 13 11 14 for immediate support, or you can contact Stepping Out during business hours. And our number is on the Stepping Out website. I'd really like to thank our amazing speakers today, Georgia, Andrea, and Jackie. And thank you to all attendees for joining us and for continuing to support female survivors of childhood sexual abuse. If you would like to support Stepping Out program, and please do, to continue their vital work supporting female survivors of childhood sexual abuse, please go to the website and donate to steppingout.org.au. I'd just like to leave you with a statistic, and please remember that we are the faces of these statistics. These statistics do have human lives behind them, that 1 in 6 women do identify as having been sexually abused before the age of 15. Now, those numbers are inconceivable, but they are reality. And to add to that, we also know that it's above a 90% rate of unreported abuse statistics. So we still have so many more accounts of abuse that we do not know about, because as you've heard today, there is a lot of shame and stigma which keeps survivors silent. So our take-home message today is, it is hard to hear, but it's time to listen. And as Andrea said, time to ask as well. So I am Rene Michele. Thank you and goodbye.